So our first panelist is Dr. Christian Coseru. He's a professor of philosophy at the College of Charleston with an expertise on dialogue between Indian and Buddhist philosophy and Western philosophy. And his title is Engineering Enlightenment, Artificial Mind and the Platform and Perils of Synthetic Phenomenology. Let's welcome Professor Christian Coseru.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation, Venerable Aoife. Also, thank you for your wonderful and very moving eulogy to Professor Robson's mother. That was very moving. Thank you. So, in the interest of lightening up the mood a little bit, so the title for my talk in the program is different than the one I'm giving here. There have been some last-minute changes. So I'm going to be, I want to direct your attention to the question mark there in the title, Engineering Enlightenment, because we're going to come back to that. So in preparation for, is this working? Yeah. Oh, yes. So in preparation for today's talk, I did what every scholar would do. I consulted ChatGPT, if I can get it to work. I seem to have a problem here. Ah, there we go. So it seems to be a bit slow this morning. But not just any ChatGPT. One of the clients that OpenAI is providing, and that is the Monk GPT, which is a wise virtual monk offering Zen-inspired advice. I could, of course, given the topic, given that Buddhism and AI in the same sentence tends to raise quite a few eyebrows, I could have turned to several other clients: IT monk, mountain monk, sarcastic monk, enlightened monk, corporate monk, even procrastination monk, but I'll stick for now with Monk GPT. So I asked Monk GPT, is Buddhism compatible with the goals of the AI revolution? And the answer is quite surprising. Buddhism and AI, we're told, two concepts that at first glance might seem worlds apart, yet when you dig deeper, there are fascinating points of convergence. Buddhism emphasizes mindfulness, compassion, and the interconnectedness of all things. It's about understanding the nature of mind and alleviating suffering. AI, on the other hand, is about creating intelligent systems that can learn, adapt, and potentially improve our lives in countless ways. And he continued, imagine an AI designed with Buddhist principles in mind. This is part of the conversation so far. It could prioritize empathy and ethical decision-making, ensuring that technological advancements benefit humanity as a whole, not just a select few. Think of how mindful practices in Buddhism could influence the development of AI to be more attuned to human needs, promoting well-being rather than mere efficiency. And it continues. Of course, there are challenges. The rapid pace of AI development can sometimes feel at odds with the slow, introspective nature of Buddhist practice. And he concluded with a question for me, and that is, what do you think? Could this harmonious blend pave the way for a future where technology and spirituality coexist and enhance each other? I'll come back to that question later on. And you might wonder, why turn to Monk GPT? Why not consult Scholar GPT? Well, I actually did consult Scholar GPT, and Scholar GPT had a very different answer. Scholar GPT's answer was a little more systematic, but it also drew attention that while AI can create opportunities, it can also displace jobs, leading to economic inequality and social harm. And more importantly, there are also potential conflicts, particularly in the areas of labor displacement, mental health impacts, and social harmony. It is really hard to, one has to remember sometimes that these are just randomly generated linguistic patterns based on the system's training data that really have they're just based on maps of its syntactic rules with no reference to meaning, but it's nonetheless very, very impressive. So the context for the talk I'm going to be presenting today has to do with a conversation that I had recently in print with a colleague, a fellow philosopher of mind, Susan Schneider, who is the author of this book, Artificial You, in which she brings certain elements of Buddhist thought, Buddhist philosophy, particularly Buddhist philosophy of personal identity, in the dialogue with contemporary discussions about the scope of AI. And she's presenting us with a wonderful, interesting scenario here. So it's no longer 2024, it is actually 2045, so fast forward 22 decades or so. And so she's inviting us to consider a shopping trip, a shopping trip to the Center for Mind Design, where as you walk in, a large menu stands before you. It lists brain enhancements with funky names like Hive Mind, which is a brain chip allowing you to experience the innermost thoughts of your loved ones. There is Zen Garden, which is a microchip for Zen master-level meditative states. And there's Human Calculator, and so on. More interesting is the fact that, as Schneider argues, like human philosophers, alien thinkers, she's inviting us to sort of push the frontier of this thought experiment and project ourselves even in the more distant future. Like human philosophers, alien thinkers may also come to appreciate the difficulty in possibly intractable issues that personal identity is raised by cognitive enhancement. What you do when you go to the Center for Mind Design, you're picking up various kinds of devices that enhance your cognitive capacities. And here she turns to the Buddha and to the British philosopher Derek Parfit. She says, perhaps in some other distant worlds, philosophers like Buddha and Parfit concluded on reflections, on the reflections similar to those of Parfit and the Buddha, that there's really no real survival, in part because, like the Buddha, Parfit subscribed to a conception of personal identity based on the aggregate model. And so not believing in a self, in an enduring permanent self, they opted to constantly enhance themselves and to upload themselves in ever more sophisticated systems, computer systems, artificial systems, and so on. So in response to Schneider, I point out that this rather simplistic, almost cartoonish understanding of the scope of Buddhist philosophy of mind, particularly as far as conceptions of personal identity are concerned, can be rather problematic and perilous. So conceptions of personal identity, I argue, rooted in relations of psychological continuity and connectedness, like those proposed by Parfit and the Buddha, may not provide the sort of grounding that many transhumanists chasing the dream of life extension think that they do. The prospect of enhancement reinforces a deeply ingrained sense of self, as exemplified by a persistent concern among techno-optimists with life extension, mind uploading, and the general idea of transferring a self-identical human consciousness from a biological brain to a computer. So this all serves as a preamble to what I'm going to be talking about in the 15 minutes that I have left. I'm going to be raising two questions. One, is the prospect of artificial minds good or bad for Buddhism? Does Buddhist reductionism, the Buddhist reductionism is the account of personal identity based on the ideas that there is no permanent self, that we reduce to a number of aggregates. Does that conception of personal identity support patternist conceptions so does Buddhist reductionism support patternist conceptions of personal identity? And I'm going to raise the issue of synthetic phenomenology. So let me start with the prospect that we all face with advances in AI, the sort of advances that would prompt a conference like this that explores the scope of AI and technological advancements in this domain for traditional religious practices such as Buddhism. So the AI revolution does confront us with the long-term possibility of artificial consciousness and synthetic phenomenology. The concept of synthetic phenomenology itself is somewhat problematic. It was introduced by an American psychologist more than 2 decades ago, Scott Jordan, and he invited us to think of synthetic phenomenology along the lines we think of synthetic biology, which combines science and engineering to construct biological functions and systems that are not found in nature. Think, for instance, of modifying rice to produce beta-carotene. In a similar vein, modeling, designing, so synthetic phenomenology will be concerned with modeling, designing, and developing conscious systems, including their states and functions on artificial hardware. And the scope of this enterprise, this scientific enterprise, is to examine systems for representational and phenomenal mental states and establish whether, indeed, work on machine consciousness is or will eventually be successful in creating artificial conscious states. So, does Buddhism align well with the goals of AI? Several scholars and several Buddhists, particularly those who affiliate with Pure Land traditions, have argued recently, and certain Buddhists with transhumanist sympathies and vice versa, certain transhumanists with Buddhist sympathies, have argued that indeed Buddhism aligns quite well with the goals of the AI revolution. I call this claim the complementarity claim. And I argue that this claim is based on an instrumental view of moral and mental cultivation. The rationale behind the claim is that moral and mental cultivations are tools or techniques for achieving our human or even post or transhuman potential. If that is the case, then yes, there is no principled objection to using AI to enhance moral and mental practice. But the complementarity claim is based on a conception of AI systems as cultural artifacts, on par with other communicating technologies. Think of Apple's Siri or Amazon's Alexa. Examples of this are, for instance, the use of pepper, right, to perform funeral rites in Japan, or the more famous case of Mindar, right? I think one of my colleagues is going to talk about Mindar later on today. So that's not the aspect of AI that I'm really focusing here, since the talk is on artificial minds rather than AI proper. The questions that concerns me here is whether AI systems as precursors to AGI are compatible with the goals of a Buddhist practice. The prospect of AGI means, of course, artificial minds exhibiting the full range of human cognitive and conscious capacities. And of course, as many argue, such systems would pose a serious existential threat. The question is whether Buddhism is immune to such threats. And the second question that I'm going to be, hopefully, I get a chance to address is whether the goal of creating synthetic consciousness is compatible with Buddhism. I will have an argument against that claim, and one on its support, and a rejoinder. So many of you are familiar with Masahiro Mori's uncanny valley hypothesis, the Japanese roboticist who almost half a century ago came up with this idea that as we are beginning to design robotic systems that resemble humans or appear human, we seem to be excited and warm up to the prospect until they begin to be very, very similar to humans, at which point our similarities our enthusiasm gives rise to, it's replaced by sort of an uncanny, unsettling feeling. But he's also known for having argued that, as a Buddhist and as a scientist, that there is such a thing as a Buddha nature inside the robots. That is, he thought that robots have the potential to achieve Buddhahood. I'm going to leave that claim to the side. I'm going to just say one more thing about this uncanny valley hypothesis. He basically said, well, there's one way to avoid that trap, in some sense, of making robots seem uncanny to humans. That is sort of, again, sort of this creepy feeling as they approach human-like abilities and looks. And he said one way to do that is to design them so they don't look, so stay clear of the so-called valley, as he articulated. And his suggestions were that we build them not to resemble humans. So in some sense, you could say that Hiroshi Ishiguro's latest android goes against Mori's suggestion. So he would prefer that someone like Pepper, it's sort of a much more approachable way to think of robotic systems that don't really, are not affected by that psychological attitude. So let me say a few things about reductionism and the patternist conceptions of personal identity that inform this conviction that Buddhism and AI share common goals. And here I want to first say a few things about Buddhist reductionism proper and about patternism. Buddhist reductionism is what we philosophers, those of us who work in philosophy of mind and Buddhist philosophy, refer to when we talk about Abhidharma. The idea is that a reductionist account of human identity reduces the individual, the person, to a collection of aggregates, and they reduce even further. It's what we refer to as mereological nihilism, where eventually reduction reduces to the most sort of primitive building blocks. The whole idea is to work against the conception that there is such a thing as an enduring self. But Buddhism is also host to to a tradition of personalism that didn't really fare quite well historically, to a rich tradition in philosophy of mind, where much of the debate revolves around the idea of self-awareness, particularly the nature of self-awareness, whether self-awareness is reflexive or irreflexive. And as with the awakening of faith tradition, of course, we have a rich literature on the Buddha nature. All of this is just a short way of saying that Buddhism is very much friendly and germane with a conception of personal identity as involving patterns. Patternism, as it is understood today, is a conception of personal identity based on the software approach to the mind. And it claims that the mind is simply a software program running on the hardware of the brain. It's a set of algorithms that the brain implements, and these algorithms are something that different subfields of cognitive science seek to describe. The question, of course, is whether Buddhist reductionism provides support for this patternist conception of personal identity. You might ask, what motivates patternism? And what motivates it is the possibility of describing and modeling the brain's function computationally. And the idea is that if it can be described and modeled computationally, well, we can in principle conceive of a way of uploading it to a non-biological substrate, a computer, for instance. And this is precisely the idea that futurists like Kurzweil have been popularizing for several decades now. He's got a book that's coming out, I think, just in a week or so, warning us that the singularity is even nearer. It was not near enough. Now it's getting even nearer. But patternism, of course, is problematic. It confronts a personal identity dilemma. Beyond just the many issues of patternism, Kurzweil's understanding of brain science have been called into question by many of his colleagues. Indeed, many have argued that the brain itself is not computable. My colleague Evan Thompson made that case yesterday. Even sort of rhetorical questions, reverse engineering the human brain, really. Furthermore, there is sort of a wide consensus that we don't yet have a current theory of consciousness that's agreed upon by all people in the field, and many of you who may be familiar with debates in consciousness studies. There's a rather rousing, interesting sort of session at the last year's Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness conference in New York City, where the neuroscientist Christoph Koch lost a wager, a 25-year-old wager to David Chalmers. The wager 25 years ago was that in 25 years we will have a theory of consciousness that's agreed upon by all, at least by the majority of scientists in the field. Well, we don't have that, so he lost the bet. I think he won a sort of a bottle of, or a case of wine or something like that. Anyway, so I'm not going to have time to go into some of the reasons that inform the patternist conception that Kurzweil's referred to, but it has to do with the decades old research on the columnar organization of neural networks. That research has been used, obviously, in the modeling of the neural network architecture of deep learning systems. But to many scholars of Buddhist philosophy and Buddhists themselves who have an interest in science, the patternism has a certain appeal. And they often point to, for instance, the chain of the 12 Nidanas, the chains of dependent arising, to say, look, Buddhism already, in some sense, possesses in a nutshell a conception of patternism that can now avail itself of the conceptual tools and methodologies of science and expand on that. In fact, Buddhism is not really alien, is not antagonist to this patternist conception. So if you can only figure out a way to work out Buddhism patterns in a way that's conversant with that certain areas of philosophy of mind and neuroscience, then we'll find that Buddhism and AI can have a common future. So. Now, I'm not going to have time to say much about the Buddhist personalist, but I do want to say one thing, and that is that for the Pudgalavadins, the so-called Buddhist personalist, the notion of the person is essential because we could not really give an account of human agencies. Particularly, we couldn't give an account of what the aggregates that we presumably reduce to do or when they act together. We couldn't really give a proper account of agency because we are primarily agents. We're the sort of things to whom we can attribute deeds and intentions. And we're also conscious subjects. And so much of the discussion in Buddhist philosophy of mind in classical India, and eventually as Buddhism moves across to East Asia, concerns this debate about how it is that we can account for personal identity, for agency, for intentionality, for consciousness, if we're wedded to this reductionist account of persons. So what I propose in my article in response to Schneider is a view of persons as dynamic unities rather than as mere collection of parts. That is, I propose a functionalist account of persons. Persons are essential if we're to give a coherent account of who we really are. So, for instance, if we want to understand what categorizes something as killing rather than simply the rearranging of material elements, we need a conception of intentional actions. We also need a conception of ourselves as agentive and self-disclosing wholes. There is a huge blind spot on experience. I won't have time to go into that, but I will say a few things about synthetic phenomenology and give you the final two arguments. So much of the debate nowadays is whether a functionalist account of the mind can serve as the theoretical background for beginning to think about whether machines could be conscious if they get sufficiently complex. So, for instance, the neuroscientist Stanislav Dehaene and his colleagues have argued that while current artificial neural networks inspired by neurobiology, by the neurobiology approach, approach in some instances surpass human level of cognitive processing, we're not anywhere on the verge of consciousness. Why? Because computations implemented by current deep learning networks correspond mainly to non-conscious brain operations, and so the systems behave as if they are conscious, but they're not really conscious. Nonetheless, they recognize that such functional accounts leave aside the experiential aspects of consciousness. So there are limitations to these research programs. I don't really have time to go into that. But I want to return to the complementarity claim that I articulated at the beginning of the talk, the idea that Buddhism aligns well with the goals of the AI revolution, and offer two arguments in conclusion and one objection. Here's the argument against the complementarity claim, listed in a series of premises. The primary goal of the AI revolution is to create artificial minds capable of human-level intelligence. Artificial minds would, in principle, exhibit synthetic phenomenal qualities. The presence of synthetic phenomenology means that such minds would be capable of suffering. Therefore, mass production of artificial minds means increasing suffering on an industrial scale. The goal of Buddhism, on the other hand, is the elimination of suffering for all sentient beings. Therefore, the AI revolution is counter to the goal of Buddhism. Now, you might look at this argument and might say, well, okay, that sounds interesting, but I don't like that premise 3 there, this idea that the presence of synthetic phenomenology means that such minds would be capable of suffering. What about you change that premise to something like artificial minds by design will be capable of countering the negative phenomenal qualities and developing positive ones for themselves and in human-machine interactions. Therefore, rather than the goals of Buddhism being at odds with that of AI, the AI revolution is complementary to the goals of Buddhism. That's all fine and good, but I'd like to offer a further objection here against the complementarity argument. AI systems capable of human-level intelligence will no longer be simply tools. Rather, they will resemble agents and beings. Programming AI systems to exhibit agency means programming them to be autonomous. Autonomous systems face the problem of alignment. How can we build AI systems that are both autonomous and aligned with human interests? Whose interests are those? Those are the corporations, the state, the military, the dominant religion of ideology. So call this the complementarity objection. Again, my time is up here. So I leave you here with the objection. Thank you.
Thank you.